Tonight on Gay Timeline, we are turning back the clock to 1889 Paris, to a narrow street called Rue de Lappe, where gaslights flicker against cobblestones and the air smells like cheap wine and expensive secrets. Behind an unmarked door, in a building that looks like every other building on the block, men are paying for something the law says does not exist. They had no word for what they were, but they had each other. And tonight, we say their names out loud because they could not. I am Julian. This is Gay Timeline. In the spring of 1889, a man named Émile Bergerac walked down Rue de Lappe at 11:30 at night. He was 43 years old. He wore a wool coat with a velvet collar. His hands were shaking. Émile was a clerk at the Ministry of Finance. He had a wife named Marguerite and 2 daughters. He lived in a respectable apartment in the 16th arrondissement. And twice a month, sometimes 3 times when the loneliness got bad enough, he walked down Rue de Lappe and knocked on a green door with no number and waited for someone to let him in. The man who opened the door that night was named Henri Dubois. He was 28. He had dark hair and darker eyes, and a scar along his left jaw from a knife fight in Belleville when he was 16. Henri looked at Émile the way a shopkeeper looks at a customer. Polite, practiced, utterly without judgment. Henri stepped aside. Émile walked in. The door closed behind him. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand something Paris believed about men like Émile in 1889. Something most history books still refuse to say plainly. If you find yourself drawn into this story, the like and subscribe buttons are there for you. But only if this is genuinely your kind of evening. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, let us go back to Rue de Lappe. For most of history, men like Émile were alone. They wrote letters no one would read. They loved in rooms no one would visit. Tonight, we keep them company. That is all sleep needs to be. A quiet act of refusing to let someone be forgotten. By the end of tonight, you will know who ran the brothel on Rue de Lappe, what happened when the police finally raided it in September 1889, and what the trial transcripts reveal about the men who walked through that green door knowing they could lose everything. The building at 47 Rue de Lappe was owned by a woman named Céleste Vautrin. She was 56 years old in 1889. She had been running brothels in Paris since 1867, back when Napoleon III still sat on a throne and the city still had medieval alleys that smelled like open sewers. Céleste knew how Paris worked. She knew which police inspectors could be paid to look the other way. She knew which neighborhoods asked questions and which neighborhoods minded their own business. And she knew, better than almost anyone alive in 1889, that there was money to be made from men who wanted other men and had nowhere else to go. Rue de Lappe sat in the 11th arrondissement, tucked between the Bastille and the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. It was not a fashionable street. It was not a street where respectable families took evening strolls. It was a street where furniture makers kept workshops, where day labourers drank in basement taverns, where the rent was cheap and the landlords did not care what you did as long as you paid on time. Céleste had opened the brothel in 1882, 7 years before the night Émile walked through the door. 7 years of men slipping in after dark and leaving before dawn. The building itself was narrow, 4 stories, limestone facade gone grey with coal smoke. The ground floor was a tobacco shop run by a man named Georges Pinet, who sold cigarettes and asked no questions about the men climbing the stairs to the 2nd floor after the shop closed at 9. The 2nd floor was where the brothel lived. 3 rooms, small, each one barely larger than the bed it contained. Wallpaper printed with faded roses, a wash basin in the corner, a single chair, a lamp with a red glass shade that turned the light the colour of wine. The men who worked there were called employees in the court records. The prosecution would later call them prostitutes. Céleste called them her boys. There were 5 of them in 1889. Henri Dubois, who opened the door for Émile. Léon Favier, 22, who had grown up in an orphanage in Lyon and came to Paris with nothing but a cloth bag and a face beautiful enough to make men stupid. Auguste Moreau, 19, who still had acne on his cheeks and wrote letters to his mother in Rouen every Sunday, lying about what he did for work. Paul Renard, 31, who had been a soldier once and still walked like one. And Théo Blanchard, 24, who played piano in a café on Rue de Charonne 4 nights a week and needed the extra money because musicians in Paris earned almost nothing unless they were famous. These 5 men worked for Céleste. They lived in a boarding house 2 streets over. They showed up at 47 Rue de Lappe at 8 in the evening and left at 3 in the morning. They were paid 20 francs a night. In 1889, that was more than a factory worker made in a week. The clients were men like Émile, clerks, lawyers, shop owners, a few minor aristocrats, men with wives or fiancés, men whose families would disown them if anyone found out, men who could not risk being seen in the public cruising spots along the Seine or in the Tuileries Gardens where the police ran sweeps every few months and arrested anyone who looked at another man too long. The brothel was safer, discreet, expensive enough to keep out the desperate and the dangerous. Émile paid 5 francs at the door. Henri led him upstairs to the second room on the left. Léon was waiting inside. 22 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, a smile that looked almost genuine. They spent an hour together, maybe less. The court records do not say. What the court records do say is that Émile came back 17 times between March and September 1889. 17 nights when he told Marguerite he was working late at the ministry. 17 nights when he walked down Rue de Lappe and knocked on a green door and paid 5 francs to be himself for an hour in a room with faded wallpaper. Same-sex desire was not technically illegal in France in 1889. Napoleon had decriminalized sodomy back in 1791 when the revolutionary government threw out the old Catholic legal codes and rebuilt French law from scratch. On paper, 2 men could do whatever they wanted in private, and the state did not care. On paper. In practice, Paris had other laws. Public decency laws, vagrancy laws, laws against solicitation and disturbing the peace and outraging public morals. Laws that could be stretched to fit almost any situation if the police wanted to arrest you badly enough. And there was Article 330 of the Penal Code. Exciting minors to debauchery. If you ran a brothel, if you profited from prostitution, if you facilitated immoral acts, you could be charged under Article 330, even if the acts themselves were legal. That was the law Céleste was breaking, not the sex, the business. The prefecture of police knew about 47 Rue de Lappe. Of course they knew. The police knew about every brothel in Paris. They kept lists. They ran inspections. They collected bribes. But male brothels were different. Female prostitution was regulated, taxed, medicalized. The city ran mandatory health checks for registered prostitutes. Brothels that followed the rules were tolerated, even protected. Male prostitution existed in a legal grey zone. It was not regulated. It was not medicalized. It was not supposed to exist at all. Inspector Benoit Laforge of the Vice Squad had been watching 47 Rue de Lappe since June 1889. He was 39 years old. He had been a police officer for 16 years. He had raided gambling dens and opium parlors and unlicensed dance halls. He had arrested pimps and thieves and anarchists. And he had a particular disgust for men who desired other men. A disgust he made very clear in the reports he filed with his superiors. Laforge did not care that sodomy was legal. He cared that men like Émile were walking freely through Paris, living double lives, betraying their wives, undermining the moral fabric of the Republic. He wanted to shut the brothel down. He wanted to arrest Céleste. He wanted the names of every man who walked through that door. On the night of September 14th, 1889, Laforge got his chance. The raid happened at midnight. 6 officers. They did not knock. They broke the door with an iron bar and stormed up the stairs with lanterns and batons, and the self-righteous fury of men who believed they were saving France from degeneracy. They found Céleste in the front room counting money. They found Henri and Léon and Auguste in the second-floor rooms with clients. Paul and Théo had the night off. The clients tried to run. There was nowhere to go. Laforge arrested everyone: Celeste, the 3 boys, the 3 clients, including a man named Victor Charpentier, who was a junior attaché at the Ministry of the Interior and would lose his job 4 days later when the newspapers printed his name. Émile was not there that night. He was home with Marguerite and his daughters. He would not learn about the raid until September 17th, when Laforge knocked on his door at the Ministry of Finance and asked him to come to the prefecture for questioning. The trial began in November 1889. Céleste Vautrin was charged with running a house of prostitution and inciting debauchery. Henri, Léon, and Auguste were charged as accomplices. The prosecution did not charge any of the clients, not even the 3 caught in the raid, because charging them would mean naming them publicly, and several of them had families with enough money and influence to make that politically inconvenient. The trial lasted 3 days. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from Le Figaro and Le Petit Journal filled the press gallery. Curious Parisians lined up outside hoping for seats. Male prostitution was a scandal. Male prostitution involving middle-class clients was a sensation. The prosecutor was a man named Étienne Dufour. He was 47. He had salt and pepper hair and a voice like a church bell and an absolute certainty that he was defending civilization itself. Dufour called the brothel a den of vice. He called Céleste a corrupter of youth. He called Henri and Léon and Auguste degraded creatures who had sold their bodies and their souls for money. He did not call them men. He called them inverts, degenerates, creatures against nature. He never used the word homosexual. That word was too new, too clinical. It had only been invented in 1869 by a German-Hungarian writer named Carl Maria Kurtbeny, and it had not spread into common French usage yet. In 1889, men who desired men were inverts, pederasts, sodomites. The language itself was designed to mark them as wrong. The defense attorney was a young man named Lucien Moreau, no relation to Auguste, 29 years old. This was his first major case. He had been assigned to Céleste by the court because she could not afford a private lawyer. Lucien argued that Céleste had broken no law. Prostitution was legal. Sodomy was legal. His client had simply run a business. If the state wanted to criminalize male prostitution, the legislature should pass a law saying so. Until then, Céleste was innocent. It was a good argument, a rational argument. It did not matter. The judge was a man named Armand Leclerc, 63 years old, Catholic, royalist. He had been a judge since 1852, back when France was still an empire and men like him made the rules. He listened to Lucien's argument with the expression of a man watching a child try to explain why stealing candy is actually fine. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. They found Céleste guilty. They found Henri, Léon, and Auguste guilty as accomplices. Céleste was sentenced to 2 years in prison and a fine of 500 francs. Henri received 8 months. Léon and Auguste received 6 months each. The clients were never charged. Their names were kept out of the court records. Émile Bergerac went back to his apartment in the 16th arrondissement, and his wife and his daughters, and his job at the Ministry of Finance. He never spoke about Rue de Lappe again. But we know he was there. We know because Laforge kept a list. In the police files from the raid, there is a leather notebook, worn cover, pages filled with cramped handwriting. Laforge had been watching the brothel for 3 months before the raid. He had taken notes, dates, times, physical descriptions of the men entering and leaving. He never got permission to use the notebook as evidence. His superiors told him to destroy it. Naming clients publicly would cause too much embarrassment for too many important families. Laforge ignored the order. He kept the notebook. When he died in 1904, his widow donated his papers to the Paris Police Museum. The notebook is still there, archived, catalogued, available to researchers who know to ask for it. In the notebook there are 47 names, men who visited 47 Rue de Lappe between June and September 1889. Beside each name, a date, a time, a brief description, Émile Bergerac appears 17 times. Clerk, Ministry of Finance, brown coat, wedding ring. Always asks for Léon. There is also a man named Jacques Fortin, lawyer. Came 6 times, preferred Auguste. A man named Olivier Bernard, banker. Came 11 times. Always requested Henri. A man identified only as AD, aristocrat, came 4 times, paid double to spend the night. 47 men. 47 lives that could have been destroyed if Laforge had gotten his way. The Notebook is one of the only surviving records of ordinary gay men in 19th-century Paris. Not artists, not writers, not the famous inverts like Oscar Wilde who would be destroyed in London 6 years later. Just men, clerks and lawyers and bankers, men with families, men with reputations to protect, men who walked down Rue de Lappe after dark because they had no other choice. After the trial, Céleste Vautrin was sent to Saint-Lazare prison. It sat in the 10th arrondissement, a massive stone fortress that had been a women's prison since 1794. The cells were cold, the food was cabbage soup and black bread. The other inmates were thieves and abortionists, and women who had killed their husbands. Céleste was put in a cell on the 3rd floor. She shared it with 2 other women. One was a pickpocket named Marie. The other was a brothel keeper named Simone, who had been running a house in Montmartre until the police shut her down for not paying her bribes on time. Simone and Céleste became friends. They had a lot to talk about. Céleste served 18 months of her 2-year sentence. She was released in March 1891 for good behaviour. She was 58 years old. She had lost weight. Her hair had gone completely grey. She walked with a limp from the damp cells. She never opened another brothel. She moved to a small apartment in Belleville and took in sewing work. She died in 1897. Pneumonia. She was 64. The death certificate lists her occupation as seamstress. It does not mention what she did before. Henri Dubois served his 8 months in La Santé prison, the men's prison, south of the city. He shared a cell with forgers and con men, and a man who had stabbed his brother-in-law over a property dispute. When Henri got out in July 1890, he went back to Belleville. He found work in a tannery. The pay was terrible. The work destroyed his hands. He lasted 6 months before he went back to sex work, but this time on the streets, in the cruising areas along the Seine, where the police could arrest you any time they wanted, and there was no green door to close behind you. Henri was arrested 3 more times between 1891 and 1893. Solicitation, public indecency, disturbing the peace. Each time he spent a few weeks in jail and then went back to the streets because there was nothing else he knew how to do. In 1894, Henri disappeared from the records. No death certificate, no prison entry, no address in the city directories. He was 33 years old the last time his name appears in a police file. He simply stopped existing on paper. Léon Favier served 6 months. He was released in February 1890. He was 23. He went back to the boarding house where he had lived before the arrest. The landlady refused to let him in. She had read about the trial in the newspapers. She did not want degenerates under her roof. Léon slept rough for 2 weeks. Late February in Paris. Cold enough to kill. He finally found a room in a boarding house in the 19th arrondissement that took anyone who could pay. The room was smaller than the cells at 47 Rue de Lappe. It had no heat. The window did not close all the way. Léon found work as a delivery boy for a bakery, 4 francs a day. He carried bread through the streets from 5 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. His hands froze. His feet blistered. He was still beautiful. Men still looked at him. One of those men was named Edouard Savigny. He was a tailor, 41 years old, widowed, no children. He had a shop on Rue de Turenne in the Marais. Edouard saw Léon delivering bread one morning in March 1890. He followed him, not in a threatening way, just curious. He watched Léon make his deliveries. He watched him count his coins at the end of his shift. He watched him buy a roll and eat it standing in the street because he could not afford to sit in a cafe. Edouard approached him. He was polite. He introduced himself. He asked if Léon wanted work. Real work. Steady work. Edouard needed someone to help in the shop. Sewing, measuring, keeping the books. Léon said yes. They worked together for 3 years. Edouard taught Léon how to cut patterns and stitch buttonholes and fit a jacket so it hung just right. Léon had good hands. He learned fast. In the summer of 1891, Edouard told Léon he could move into the apartment above the shop. It had 2 rooms. Edouard lived there alone. There was space. Léon moved in. What happened next is not in any official record. There are no letters, no diaries, no legal documents. But there is a will. When Edouard Savigny died in 1903, his will left the tailor shop and the apartment and all his savings to Léon Favier. The will called Léon his loyal companion and dearest friend. The notary who filed the will noted that the 2 men had lived together for 12 years. Léon ran the tailor shop until 1927. He never married. He lived in the apartment above the shop until he died in 1934. He was 67 years old. In the death notice published in Le Figaro, he is identified as Léon Favier, tailor, formerly of Lyon. There is no mention of the trial, no mention of Rue de Lappe, no mention of the 6 months he spent in prison for the crime of needing money badly enough to sell the only thing he had. But someone remembered, because when Léon died, his funeral was attended by 43 people. The parish record lists them as friends and colleagues, tailors, shopkeepers, a few elderly men who had known Edouard. One of the mourners signed the guest book with just initials. A.M. The handwriting is shaky, the signature of someone old. Auguste Moreau. Auguste served his 6 months. He was released in February 1890, the same day as Léon. He was 19 years old. He went back to Rouen, back to his mother. She knew. Of course she knew. The newspapers had printed his name. Her neighbours had read the papers. Her priest had read the papers. Everyone in Rouen knew that her son had been arrested in Paris for working in a brothel for inverts. Auguste's mother was a laundress. She had raised him alone after his father died, when Auguste was 7. She had worked herself half to death to keep him fed and clothed and in school. She had believed he went to Paris to find respectable work as a clerk or a shop assistant. When Auguste came home, she let him in. She fed him. She did not ask questions. She did not yell. She just looked at him with an expression that made him wish she had yelled. 2 weeks later, Auguste left. He could not stand the silence. He could not stand the way his mother's friends crossed the street when they saw him. He could not stand going to church and feeling every eye on his back. He went to Marseille. Far enough from Paris that no one knew his name, far enough from Rouen that he could breathe. Auguste found work on the docks, loading cargo, 12-hour days, brutal work. The kind of work that breaks your back by the time you are 30, but it paid, and no one asked where he had been or what he had done. In Marseille, Auguste met a man named Claude Rimbaud, a sailor, 26 years old, broad shoulders, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a docking accident in Algiers. Claude and Auguste became friends, then more than friends. They were careful, they were quiet. They shared a rented room near the old port and told the landlord they were cousins. They lived together for 11 years. In 1901, Claude's ship went down in a storm off the coast of Corsica. 43 men drowned. Claude was one of them. He was 37 years old. Auguste stayed in Marseille. He kept loading cargo. He kept living in the room they had shared. He kept Claude's pipe on the mantel and his coat hanging by the door. Auguste died in 1922. He was 51. Tuberculosis. The kind dock workers got from breathing salt air and coal dust for 30 years. His death certificate lists no next of kin, no wife, no children, no surviving family, just a rented room and a pipe that had belonged to someone else. But in the room, the landlord found a wooden box. Inside were letters, dozens of letters, Auguste had written them to his mother over the years. Letters he never sent. Letters where he tried to explain. Letters where he apologized. Letters where he told her about Claude and the life they had built, and how he wished she could have known him. The landlord burned the letters. He thought he was being kind. He thought he was protecting Auguste's reputation. We only know the letters existed because the landlord mentioned them years later to a journalist writing about the Marseille docks. The journalist put it in a footnote. The footnote is in an archive in Aix-en-Provence. That is all that is left of Auguste Moreau. A footnote. A death certificate. A wooden box that held letters no one will ever read. The brothel at 47 Rue de Lappe never reopened. After the raid, the building stood empty for 2 years. The tobacco shop on the ground floor closed. Georges Pinet, the man who sold cigarettes and asked no questions, moved to Lyon. He died there in 1895. In 1891, the building was sold to a furniture maker named Antoine Leblanc. He turned the second floor into a workshop. The 3 rooms where Henri and Léon and Auguste had worked became storage for wood and varnish and half-finished chairs. The building still stands. 47 Rue de Lappe is now a restaurant. It serves North African food, couscous and tagine and mint tea. The second floor is an apartment. A young couple lives there. They have no idea what the rooms were used for in 1889. But the street remembers. Rue de Lappe became one of the centres of gay Paris in the 20th century. By the 1920s, there were gay bars and clubs and dance halls all along the street. After World War II, it was one of the few places in Paris where 2 men could dance together without getting arrested. The street has changed now, gentrified. The gay bars are mostly gone, replaced by cocktail lounges and organic bakeries. But if you walk down Rue de Lappe at night, if you know the history, you can still feel it. The weight of all those men who walked this street when it was dangerous, when it was the only place they had. Inspector Laforge kept working for the Vice Squad until 1898. He ran raids on gambling dens and opium parlours and dance halls where men danced with men. He arrested hundreds of people over his career. He was proud of his work. He believed he was protecting Paris. In his personal papers, donated to the police museum after his death, there is a journal entry from November 1889, right after the trial. He wrote, "Today the court handed down sentences in the Vautrin case. 2 years for the woman. Months for her accomplices. It is not enough. These creatures should be removed from society entirely. They are a disease. They spread corruption. I have done my duty, but the law is too weak. France is too forgiving. We tolerate what we should eradicate." Laforge never married. He lived alone in a small apartment near the Bastille. When he died in 1904, his funeral was attended by 12 people. All of them were fellow officers. His obituary in Le Petit Journal praised his dedication to public morality. It did not mention the notebook. It did not mention the 47 names. The notebook is still in the police museum. You need special permission to view it. The museum considers it a sensitive document. They worry about privacy. They worry about descendants. But the men in that notebook are all dead now. Émile Bergerac died in 1911. Jacques Fortin died in 1908. Olivier Bernard died in 1913. The man identified only as AD is unknown. He might have died in the trenches of World War I. He might have lived to be 90. We will never know most of their stories. We only know they existed. We only know they walked down Rue de Lappe and knocked on a green door and paid 5 francs to be themselves for an hour. That is worth remembering. That is worth saying out loud. There were other brothels. Of course there were. Paris, in 1889, had dozens of places where men could meet other men for sex. Some were more discreet than Celeste's operation. Some were more dangerous. In the Latin Quarter, there was a café called Le Palais, where university students went to meet older men. The café is mentioned in police reports from 1887 and 1891. It was raided twice. Both times, the owner paid a fine and reopened a week later. In Montmartre, there was a dance hall called Le Bal de la Montagne, where men danced with men every Saturday night. The police knew about it. They mostly left it alone because the owner paid his bribes and kept the noise down and made sure no one caused trouble in the street. Near Les Halles, the central market, there were bathhouses. Public baths where men went to wash and also to meet other men in the steam rooms and the changing areas. The bathhouses were legal. What happened in them was technically legal. But the police kept watch. They made notes. They remembered faces. The Tuileries Gardens were a cruising ground. So were the banks of the Seine near Pont-Neuf. So were certain streets in the Marais. Men knew where to go. They developed signals. A glance held too long. A hand brushed against another hand. A conversation about nothing that meant everything. It was dangerous. It was always dangerous. But it was also the only option. Because in 1889, there were no gay bars advertising themselves openly. There were no community centres. There were no support groups or activist organisations or pride parades. There was no language for gay identity that was not medical or criminal. The word homosexual existed, but it was used by doctors, not by the men themselves. What existed instead was a network, invisible, fragile, built on whispers and rumours and trust. You learned about places like 47 Rue de Lappe from a friend, or a lover, or a stranger you met in the Tuileries, who looked at you a certain way and said, "I know a place." You went once. If it felt safe, you went again. You learned the rhythms, the unspoken rules, when to arrive, how much to pay, how to leave without being followed, and you never wrote it down. You never told anyone who did not need to know, because the difference between being tolerated and being destroyed was information. Who knew? Who talked? Who kept your secrets? Émile Bergerac kept the secret for 22 years. From 1889, when the brothel was raided, until 1911, when he died. He never told Marguerite. He never told his daughters. He went to his grave with Rue de Lappe locked inside him. But the secret leaked anyway. It always does. In 1909, 2 years before Émile died, one of his daughters got engaged. Her name was Pauline. She was 26. She was marrying a lawyer named Charles Montand. Charles's father was a retired judge. He wanted to make sure his son was marrying into a respectable family, so he hired an investigator, a private detective who specialized in checking the backgrounds of potential in-laws. The detective's name was René Cartier. He was very good at his job. He had contacts in the police. He had access to old records. He knew how to ask questions without making it obvious what he was looking for. René found the notebook, or rather, he found someone who had seen the notebook. A retired police clerk who remembered the Vautrin case and remembered seeing a list of names that was never made public. The clerk told René that Émile Bergerac's name was on that list. René reported this to Charles's father. The judge read the report. He thought about it for a week. Then he told Charles. Charles called off the engagement. Pauline was heartbroken. She did not understand. Charles would not explain. He just said his father had concerns about her family. He said it was not her fault. He said he was sorry. Pauline never married. She lived with her mother and her sister until Marguerite died in 1920. Then she lived alone. She worked as a governess for wealthy families. She died in 1943. She was 60 years old. She never knew why Charles left. Marguerite never knew either. The investigator's report was confidential. The judge kept it in a locked drawer. When he died in 1915, his widow burned all his papers without reading them. But Émile's secret still destroyed his daughter's life. 20 years after he last walked down Rue de Lappe. That is how long shame lasts. That is how far it reaches. Not every story from Rue de Lappe ends in tragedy. Some of the men in Laforge's notebook lived full lives. They kept their secrets. They survived. There is a man listed in the notebook as JL came to the brothel 4 times in the summer of 1889. Always in the early evening. Always requested Theo, the piano player. We do not know JL's full name, but we know he paid extra. The notebook says double rate. That suggests he had money. That suggests he wanted more than an hour. There is a later entry. August 12th, 1889. JL and Theo left together, did not return. Laforge drew a line through the entry. He wrote a note in the margin. Followed to Gare de Lyon. Lost them. Theo Blanchard disappears from the Paris records in August 1889. He is not listed in any city directory after that year. He is not in any parish record. He is not in any police file. But there is a marriage record from Nice. October 1889. Theo Blanchard, musician, age 24, married to a woman named Juliette Lemaire. The marriage was almost certainly fake. A cover. Because 3 months later, there is a property record. A house purchased in Grasse, a small town in the hills above Nice. The house is registered to 2 men, Theo Blanchard and Jean-Louis Montfort, JL. They lived in that house for 31 years. Theo taught piano, Jean-Louis painted, watercolors mostly, landscapes, flowers. The local art museum in Grasse has 2 of his paintings in storage. When Theo died in 1920, Jean-Louis sold the house and moved to Italy. He died in Florence in 1928. He was 63. The house in Grasse still stands. It is a private residence now. The current owners have no idea who lived there before. But in the municipal archive in Grasse, there is a photograph. Taken in 1910, 2 men standing in front of a house. One is holding a dog. The other has his hand on the first man's shoulder. The photograph is labelled Blanchard et Montfort, 1910. They are smiling. The photograph in Grasse is one of 11 surviving images of men who passed through 47 Rue de Lappe. Most of them are formal portraits, studio photographs. The kind you sat for in your best clothes with your face carefully composed because film was expensive and you only got 1 shot. But there is one photograph that is different. It was found in 2003 during renovations of a building on Rue de Lappe, number 51, 4 doors down from where the brothel had been. The construction crew tore down a wall and found a gap between the original stone and a later addition. Inside the gap was a metal box. Inside the box were papers, letters, receipts, and 1 photograph. The photograph shows 5 young men sitting on a bench. They are outside. You can see cobblestones, a gas lamp, the edge of a doorway. The photograph is damaged, water-stained, faded, but you can still make out faces. On the back of the photograph, someone wrote in pencil, Les garçons, juin 1889, the boys, June 1889, 3 months before the raid. The handwriting matches samples of Céleste Vautrin's writing from court documents. She took this photograph, or she kept it, or she wrote on it. We know it mattered to her because she hid it. The 5 men in the photograph are almost certainly Henri, Léon, Auguste, Paul, and Theo, the 5 employees of the brothel. You cannot see their faces clearly enough to match them to other photographs, but the date is right. The location is right. The number of men is right. They are sitting close together, shoulders touching. One of them is laughing. You can see it in the way his head is tilted back. Another has his arm around the man next to him. It is casual, easy, the kind of touch that suggests comfort. They look happy. That photograph is now in the archives of the Bibliothèque historique de la ville de Paris. It sits in a climate-controlled vault with other fragile documents from the period. Researchers can request to see it. Most do not know it exists. But if you do see it, if you sit in the reading room with white gloves on your hands and look at those 5 young men sitting in the summer sun 3 months before their lives were destroyed, you cannot help but wonder what they were talking about, what they were laughing about, whether they had any idea what was coming. Paul Renard, the former soldier, was not arrested during the raid because he had the night off. He found out about it the next morning when he showed up for work and saw the broken door. Paul ran. He did not go back to his boarding house. He did not collect his things. He just ran. He made it as far as the train station before he realized he had no money for a ticket. He had been paid the night before, but he had spent most of it on a meal and a bottle of wine. He had 3 francs left, not enough to get out of Paris. Paul slept in the station that night, on a bench. He woke up at dawn when the first trains started arriving and the station filled with travellers and porters and police officers checking papers. He left before anyone could ask him questions. For 2 weeks, Paul moved through Paris like a ghost. He slept in doorways and under bridges. He ate what he could steal or beg. He avoided the neighbourhoods where he might be recognised. He did not dare go near Rue de Lappe. On the 3rd week, Paul ran into a man named Félix Arnaud. They had served together in the army. Paul had been stationed in Algeria in 1882. So had Félix. They had not seen each other in 7 years. Félix was working as a security guard at a warehouse near the Gare du Nord. He took one look at Paul, dirty and desperate and half-starved, and asked what happened. Paul told him. Not everything, but enough. He said he had been working at a place that got raided. He said the police were looking for him. He said he needed to disappear. Félix did not ask for details. He just nodded. He took Paul to a boarding house run by a woman who owed Félix a favour. She gave Paul a room and did not ask for his name. Félix got Paul a job at the warehouse, night shift, loading and unloading freight. It was the same kind of brutal physical work Auguste would end up doing in Marseille, the kind that breaks your body, but it paid. Paul worked at that warehouse for 6 years. He kept his head down. He did not make friends. He showed up on time and did the work and left. In 1895, Paul enlisted in the army again. He was 36 years old for a soldier. But the army was always desperate for men willing to serve in the colonies. They did not ask too many questions. Paul was sent to Madagascar. France had just invaded the island. The fighting was brutal. Tropical diseases killed more men than combat. Malaria, dysentery, yellow fever. Paul survived the fighting. He did not survive the disease. He died in a military hospital in Antananarivo in 1897. He was 38. The cause of death listed on his military record is fever, type unknown. Paul was buried in a military cemetery outside the city. His grave is marked with a wooden cross and a metal plate with his name and regiment number. No date of birth, no hometown, just Paul Renard, soldat. The cemetery still exists. It sits on a hillside overlooking the city. Most of the graves are overgrown now. The wooden crosses have rotted. The metal plates are covered in rust and moss. But in 2011, a French historian named Claire Deschamps visited the cemetery. She was researching French colonial soldiers. She photographed every grave she could find. She documented every name. When she got back to Paris, she cross-referenced the names with military records and police records and court documents. That is how she connected Paul Renard, soldier who died in Madagascar, with the brothel on Rue de Lappe. Claire published her findings in a small academic journal in 2013. The article was 6 pages long. It was titled, Men Who Disappeared, Tracking the Employees of the Vautrin Brothel. Almost no one read it. The journal had a circulation of about 200. Most of those were university libraries. But the article exists, and because it exists, Paul Renard exists, not just as a name in a police file or a cross in a forgotten cemetery. He exists as a person, a man who worked and ran and survived and died far from home. That matters. It has to matter. The clients who visited Rue de Lappe came from all over Paris, from every arrondissement, from every social class. The notebook, Inspector Laforge, kept lists occupations. There were 14 clerks, 8 lawyers, 5 bankers, 3 shopkeepers, 2 doctors, 1 priest, 1 actor, 1 military officer, and 11 men listed only as bourgeois, which meant they had money but no specific profession. Rentiers, men who lived on inherited wealth. The youngest client was listed as approximately 18. The oldest was listed as approximately 65. Most of them came alone. But there are 3 entries where Laforge noted 2 men arriving together. Friends, he wrote in the margin, or lovers already. Came for the discretion. That detail is important. The brothel was not just a place to buy sex. It was a place to be safe. A place where two men who were already together could go without fear of being seen by neighbors or colleagues or family. In 1889 Paris, there were almost no private spaces for gay men. If you lived with your family, you could not bring someone home. If you lived in a boarding house, the landlord would evict you if they suspected. Hotels kept registers. The police checked the registers. If two men checked into a room together, questions would be asked. The brothel solved that problem. You paid for a room. You got privacy. What you did in that privacy was your business. One of the entries in the notebook describes a couple Laforge identified as MC and RD. They came to Rue de Lappe 6 times between July and September 1889. Every visit was on a Friday night. They always stayed for 2 hours. They always paid for the same room. Laforge noted, "Do not use the employees. Bring their own wine. Leave together." MC and RD were using the brothel as a hotel, a safe house. They were paying for space, not for sex. Laforge found this deeply offensive. He wrote in his journal, "These men mock the very purpose of the law. They use a house of prostitution not for vice, but for romance, as if their perversion was something tender. It is not. It is corruption wearing the mask of love." Laforge tried to identify MC and RD. He followed them twice. Both times he lost them in the crowds near the Bastille. He never learned their full names. But there is a faint possibility we know who one of them was. In the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale, there is a collection of letters donated by the family of a man named Marcel Chevalier. Marcel was a bookseller. He owned a small shop in the Latin Quarter. He died in 1924. He never married. Among his papers, there is a series of letters written to someone named Robert. The letters span from 1887 to 1903. 16 years. They are love letters, explicit, passionate, vulnerable. In one letter, dated August 1889, Marcel writes, "My dearest Robert, I count the days until Friday. Our little room waits for us, and I have bought the wine you love. Let the world believe what it wants. For 2 hours we will have our own world. That is enough. That has to be enough." Marcel's initial was M. The letter is addressed to Robert, RMC and RD. It is not proof. It might be coincidence. But the date is right. The day of the week is right. The detail about the wine is right. If Marcel Chevalier and Robert D were the couple Laforge saw, then they survived the raid. They kept seeing each other. The letters continue for 14 more years. The last letter is dated April 1903. Marcel writes, "We are old men now, you and I. Our knees ache, our hands shake. But I would not trade a single Friday, not one. When I die, burn these letters. Do not let them make you a target, but know that I loved you. Know that every moment was worth it." There is no record of what happened to Robert. The letters were found after Marcel died. His niece donated them to the library. She included a note. "My uncle never married. I believe these letters were important to him. I thought they should be preserved." She had no idea what she was preserving. She just knew her uncle had loved someone named Robert. The letters are catalogued under Correspondance Personnelle, Chevalier, Marcel. They are available to researchers. You need to request them specifically. Most people do not, but they are there. 163 letters, proof that two men loved each other for 16 years in a city that said their love was impossible. The priest who visited Rue de Lappe is identified in the notebook only as Father G. He came twice, both times in late August 1889, just weeks before the raid. Laforge was particularly interested in Father G. He tried to follow him. He wanted to know which parish. He wanted to expose him. He wanted to destroy him. But Father G was careful. He wore civilian clothes when he visited the brothel. He arrived after dark. He left before dawn. Laforge followed him as far as the 5th arrondissement and then lost him near the Pantheon. Laforge wrote in his journal, "A priest, a supposed man of God, wallowing in sodomy. This is what Rome has come to. This is what faith has become in the hands of degenerates. Laforgue never identified Father G, but he never stopped looking. In 1891, 2 years after the raid, a priest named Father Gabriel Rousseau was quietly removed from his position at a church in the 5th arrondissement. The official reason given was health concerns. The unofficial reason, whispered among the parishioners, was moral irregularity. Father Rousseau was sent to a monastery in Brittany, a place for priests who had disgraced themselves. He lived there for 19 years. He died in 1910. He was 54. In the monastery records, there is a confession Father Rousseau made to his abbot in 1893. The confession is sealed, but the abbot's summary is not. The summary says, Father Rousseau confessed to sins of the flesh with other men during his time in Paris. He expressed remorse. He has accepted his penance. He will remain in the monastery for the good of his soul and the reputation of the church. Father Gabriel Rousseau. Father G. Again, it is not proof, but the timeline matches, the location matches, the initial matches. If Father Rousseau was the priest in Laforgue's notebook, then his 2 visits to Rue de Lappe cost him his career, his freedom, and 19 years of his life. All because he wanted what everyone wants: to be touched, to be wanted, to not be alone. The actor listed in Laforgue's notebook came to the brothel once. July 23rd, 1889. He is identified as E.B., actor, Comédie Française. The Comédie Française was, and still is, one of the most prestigious theatre companies in France. To be employed there meant you were at the top of your profession. You were successful, you were famous, you had everything to lose. E.B. requested Henri. He stayed for 3 hours. He paid triple the normal rate. Laforgue noted, recognized him. Will investigate. But Laforgue never got the chance. The raid happened 2 months later. E.B. was never arrested. His name was never made public. There were dozens of actors at the Comédie Française in 1889 with the initials E.B. Edouard Blanc, Ernest Beaumont, Emmanuel Béraud. Any of them could have been the man who visited Rue de Lappe, or none of them. E.B. might have lied about where he worked. Clients lied all the time. They gave false names. They exaggerated their importance. They wanted to impress the employees, or they wanted to seem like someone worth protecting. But there is one detail that suggests E.B. was telling the truth. Henri Dubois, in a statement he gave to the police after his arrest, mentioned a client who worked in the theatre. Henri did not give a name. He refused to name any of the clients, even under pressure, even when the prosecutor promised him a lighter sentence if he cooperated. But Henri said, one of them was an actor, a real one. He talked about the theatre the whole time. He knew everyone, Molière, Racine. He recited poetry. He tipped well. Henri's statement is in the trial records. It is the only time any of the employees mentioned a specific client's profession. So E.B. was probably real, probably an actor, probably someone whose career would have ended if Laforgue had managed to identify him. That man, whoever he was, walked away. He went back to the stage. He went back to his life. He never knew how close he came to losing everything. Or maybe he did know. Maybe he read about the raid in the newspapers. Maybe he saw the trial coverage. Maybe he spent the rest of his life waiting for the knock on the door that never came. That is another kind of prison. The fear, the waiting, the knowledge that your life is built on a secret that could collapse at any moment. The 11 men listed as bourgeois in the notebook are the hardest to trace. They had no professions. They left no records. They were just men with money and time and desires they could not admit. But one of them left a clue. In the box found in the wall at 51 Rue de Lappe, along with the photograph and the letters, there was a receipt. It was from a jeweller on Rue de Rivoli, dated August 3rd, 1889. The receipt was for a silver cigarette case, engraved. The engraving read, Pour Henri, avec affection. A.D. for Henri, with affection. A.D. A.D. is one of the initials in Laforgue's notebook. Aristocrat, came 4 times, paid double to spend the night. The cigarette case cost 45 francs. That was a month's rent for a working-class family. It was a serious gift, the kind of gift you give to someone who matters. The receipt was in Celeste's hidden box. That means Henri gave it to her. Or she found it, or Henri asked her to keep it safe. Either way, it meant something. A silver cigarette case from a man who could afford 45 francs and wanted Henri to remember him. There is no record of what happened to the cigarette case. It was not among Henri's possessions when he was arrested. It was not mentioned in the trial. It simply disappeared. But the receipt survived. And because the receipt survived, we know that someone cared. Someone wanted Henri to have something beautiful, something that would last, even if it did not last, even if it was lost or sold or thrown away. For a moment, it existed. A piece of silver engraved with affection in a world that said affection between men was a crime. The women in this story are mostly invisible. Celeste is the exception. She ran the brothel. She took the risk. She paid the price. But there were other women. Marguerite Bergerac, Émile's wife, never knew where her husband went on those nights he said he was working late. Or maybe she did know and chose not to ask. Women in 1889 were taught not to ask questions. They were taught to manage households and raise children and pretend not to notice when their husbands came home smelling like wine and cigars and guilt. Marguerite died in 1920. She was 67. Her obituary in Le Figaro described her as a devoted wife and mother. It said she was survived by 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren. It said she would be missed. It did not say she spent 39 years married to a man who loved other men. It did not say she raised her daughters alone while her husband walked down Rue de Lappe. It did not say she died never knowing the truth. But she lived it. That has to count for something. Auguste Moreau's mother, the laundress in Rouen, kept working until she was 73. Her hands were destroyed by lye and hot water and 40 years of scrubbing other people's sheets. She died in 1912, pneumonia. She was buried in the paupers section of the municipal cemetery. Her death certificate lists 1 surviving child, Auguste. But he did not come to the funeral. He could not. He was in Marseille. He did not have the money for the train. Or maybe he did have the money but could not face Rouen, could not face the neighbours who still remembered what he had been arrested for 23 years earlier. The priest who performed the burial service noted in the parish record that the deceased's son was absent. He wrote, "Informed but did not attend. Make of that what you will. Small town judgment preserved in ink." Auguste's mother died believing her son had abandoned her. Auguste died believing his mother had never forgiven him. They were both wrong. But they never got to know that. In the letters Auguste wrote and never sent, the ones the landlord burned, there was apparently one he wrote the week his mother died. The landlord mentioned it to the journalist. He said it was the longest letter in the box. He said Auguste had crossed out whole paragraphs and rewritten them. He said the paper was stained. Water or tears or both. The landlord burned it with the rest. All we have is his memory that it existed. One man's second-hand account of a letter that said things we will never know. The prostitutes who worked in the legal brothels of Paris in 1889 were registered with the police. They carried cards. They submitted to medical examinations twice a week. They paid taxes. The state knew their names and their addresses and their health status. The men who worked at Rue de Lappe had none of that. No cards, no examinations, no legal standing. They existed in a gap between what the law acknowledged and what the city actually contained. When Celeste was arrested, the prosecutor tried to argue that the brothel should have been registered, that the employees should have been examined for venereal disease, that the whole operation was illegal precisely because it operated outside the regulatory system. Celeste's lawyer, Lucien Moreau, pointed out the obvious problem. The law did not recognize male prostitution. There was no mechanism to register a male brothel. There was no protocol for examining male prostitutes. The state had built an entire system to regulate female sexuality and ignored male sexuality completely. "You cannot," Lucien argued, "punish my client for failing to follow rules that do not exist." The judge was unmoved. He said that just because the law had not anticipated this particular form of vice did not mean it was legal. He said the absence of specific regulation was not permission. He said Celeste had exploited a loophole and the court was closing it. That reasoning, legally speaking, was nonsense, but it did not matter. The jury wanted to convict. The public wanted to convict. The newspapers wanted a scandal and a moral lesson and proof that Paris was still a Christian city that punished degeneracy. So Celeste went to prison, and the loophole stayed closed. After the trial, the Paris police quietly updated their internal guidelines. Male brothels were to be treated the same as unregistered female brothels, subject to immediate closure. Operators subject to arrest. Employees subject to arrest as accomplices. The policy was never formally announced. It was never debated in the legislature. It just became the rule. An administrative decision that criminalized something that had never quite been legal, but had never quite been illegal either. That is how most oppression works, not through dramatic laws debated in public, through quiet decisions made in offices by men who believe they are protecting society. By 1895, there were no known male brothels operating openly in Paris. The bathhouses and cafes and cruising grounds still existed. Men still found each other. But the fixed locations, the places you could return to, the places that felt almost safe, those were gone. The cost of that was invisible. You cannot measure loneliness. You cannot count the men who gave up because it was too dangerous, too exhausting, too hard to keep pretending. You cannot track the suicides that were ruled accidents. You cannot name the men who married women they did not love and lived quiet, desperate lives and died without ever saying the truth out loud. But the cost was real. It was paid in full, by men who had no choice but to pay it. The newspapers covered the Vautrin trial extensively. Le Figaro ran daily updates. Le Petit Journal sent a sketch artist to the courtroom. Le Gaulois printed editorials about the decline of French morals and the need for stricter laws. But the coverage was strange, coy. The journalists knew exactly what the brothel was. They knew what services were provided, but they could not say it directly. Newspapers in 1889 did not print the word sodomy. They did not describe sex acts. They had to dance around the subject. Le Figaro called it a house of unspeakable vice. Le Petit Journal called it a den of unnatural practices. Le Gaulois referred to acts against nature committed for profit. The only paper that came close to honesty was a small left-wing publication called La Lanterne. They ran an editorial 3 days after the verdict. The writer, who signed only as J.V., wrote, "The court has sentenced 5 people for the crime of existing outside the narrow bounds of what society deems acceptable. The law says sodomy is legal. The law says prostitution is legal. But when the two combine, suddenly the law discovers new crimes. This is not justice. This is hypocrisy wearing a wig." La Lanterne had a circulation of about 3,000. Mostly students and anarchists and people the authorities already considered troublemakers. The editorial changed nothing. But it was written. It was printed. Someone said the quiet part out loud. J.V. was never identified. The editorial is the only piece they wrote about the trial. But 34 years later, in 1923, a man named Jules Vallée died in Paris. He had been a journalist. He had worked for La Lanterne in the 1880s and 1890s. In his obituary, a former colleague mentioned that Jules had always been sympathetic to the outcasts and the misunderstood, that he had written about subjects other papers ignored, that he had believed journalism should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Jules Vallée. J.V. It is probably him. It might not be, but someone at La Lanterne looked at the trial and saw injustice instead of scandal. That person risked their job and their reputation to say so. That matters. The trial transcripts run to 214 pages. They are held at the Archives de Paris. The handwriting is difficult. 19th-century court clerks wrote in a cramped cursive that takes practice to read. But the transcripts are complete. Every witness, every statement, every argument. Reading them now is like watching a train wreck in slow motion. You know how it ends. You know Celeste is going to prison. You know Henri and Léon and Auguste are going to be convicted. But you read anyway because these are the only words we have from them, the only time their voices were recorded. Henri's testimony is 4 pages. He answered the prosecutor's questions in short sentences, yes or no. He refused to elaborate. He refused to express remorse. When the prosecutor asked if he understood that what he had done was wrong, Henri said, "I needed money. I sold what I had. That is commerce, not crime." The prosecutor said, "You sold your body. You degraded yourself." Henri said, "Men degraded me long before I charged them for it." The courtroom went silent. The prosecutor moved on. Henri's statement was not included in the newspaper coverage. Too inflammatory. Too honest. Léon's testimony is shorter. 2 pages. He cried on the stand. The transcript notes it. Witness visibly emotional. Unable to continue. Court recessed for 10 minutes. When Léon came back, the prosecutor asked him why he had taken employment at the brothel. Léon said, "I was hungry. I had no family. I had no skills. Madame Vautrin offered me work. I took it." The prosecutor said, "Did you not consider the moral implications?" Léon said, "I considered eating. I considered not freezing to death. I considered survival. Morality is a luxury I could not afford." The prosecutor called him insolent. The judge warned him to show respect to the court. Léon apologized. His voice, the transcript notes, was barely audible. Auguste did not testify. His lawyer advised against it. Auguste was 19. He looked younger. His lawyer thought putting him on the stand would make things worse. The jury would see a boy. They would assume he had been corrupted. They would blame Celeste even more. So Auguste sat silent through the entire trial. The only words attributed to him in the transcript are at the sentencing. The judge asked if he had anything to say before sentence was passed. Auguste said, "No, Your Honor." 2 words. That is all we hear from Auguste Moreau in his own voice. 2 words, and then silence. Celeste testified for 6 hours across 2 days. Her testimony takes up 41 pages of transcript. She was calm, precise. She answered every question. She did not apologize. The prosecutor asked, "Do you deny that you ran a brothel?" Celeste said, "I ran a business. I rented rooms. What my clients did in those rooms was their affair." The prosecutor said, "You employed young men to provide sexual services to other men." Celeste said, "I employed young men to keep clients company. If companionship led to intimacy, that is a private matter between adults." The prosecutor said, "You profited from sodomy." Celeste said, "Sodomy is legal in France, has been since 1791. You might want to revisit the Napoleonic Code before you lecture me on the law." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order. The prosecutor was visibly angry. He accused Celeste of mocking the court. Celeste said she was simply stating facts. The newspaper coverage described Celeste as defiant and unrepentant. They said she showed no shame. They said her attitude proved the depths of her corruption. But reading the transcript now, what comes through is clarity. Celeste knew exactly what she had done. She knew exactly why she had done it. And she refused to pretend otherwise. When the prosecutor asked why she had opened the brothel, Celeste gave an answer that was not reported in any newspaper. She said, "Because those men had nowhere else to go. Because the law says their desires are legal, but society says they are abominations. Because I saw a need and I met it. I gave them a place that was clean and safe and discreet. I protected them. And for that, you want to send me to prison." The prosecutor said, "You exploited them." Celeste said, "I employed them. I paid them well. I made sure they were not robbed or beaten or arrested. I did more for those men than the Republic ever did." The judge interrupted. He told Celeste her political commentary was not welcome. He told her to restrict her answers to the questions asked. Celeste said, "Very well, Your Honor. But the truth does not change just because you do not want to hear it." That exchange is on page 73 of the transcript. It was never reported. It exists only in the archive. But it tells you everything you need to know about Celeste Vautrin. She was 56 years old. She had been poor. She had been a prostitute herself, though that was never stated directly in the trial. She had survived decades in a city that ground up women like her and discarded them. And when she finally had the chance to run her own business, to be the one in control instead of the one being controlled, she chose to protect people the law refused to acknowledge. That is not villainy. That is something else entirely. After Celeste was released from prison in 1891, she lived another 6 years. She moved to Belleville. She took in sewing work. She lived in a single room in a building that still stands on Rue de Belleville. The building has been renovated. The ground floor is a Moroccan restaurant now. The upper floors are apartments, young professionals, students, people who have no idea that a woman who ran a brothel for gay men in 1889 once lived on the 3rd floor. Celeste did not hide. She used her real name. Her neighbors knew who she was. Some of them had read about the trial. But Belleville in the 1890s was not a neighborhood that asked too many questions. People minded their business. They let each other survive. One of Celeste's neighbors was a woman named Simone Gérard. The same Simone who had been in prison with Celeste at Saint-Lazare. Simone had been released in 1890. She had also moved to Belleville. She also took in sewing. The two women worked together. They shared clients. They shared meals. When Celeste got sick in the winter of 1897, Simone took care of her. She brought soup. She fetched the doctor. She sat with Celeste when the fever got bad. Celeste died on February 12, 1897. Pneumonia. Simone was with her. The death certificate lists Simone as a friend. The landlord told the municipal clerk that Simone was the only person who came to the funeral. Celeste was buried in the Cimetière de Belleville, a pauper's grave, unmarked. The cemetery has been expanded and reorganized 3 times since 1897. The exact location of Celeste's grave is unknown, but she was not alone at the end. Simone made sure of that. One woman who ran brothels for men staying with another woman who ran brothels for men. 2 people the world had judged and discarded, keeping each other company. That is what community looks like when the state refuses to acknowledge you exist. You build it yourself, with whoever is left standing. In 1902, 13 years after the raid, a man named Olivier Bernard died in Paris. He was 61. He had been a banker. He had been married for 37 years. He had 4 children and 9 grandchildren. His obituary in Le Figaro was respectful. It listed his accomplishments, his service on various boards and committees, his donations to charity, his membership in the Légion d'honneur. It did not mention that his name appeared in Inspector Laforge's notebook 11 times. It did not mention Rue de Lappe. But Olivier's will did something unusual. He left a bequest of 5,000 francs to an organization called the Société Philanthropique. The Société provided aid to destitute men in Paris, food, shelter, medical care. It was a secular charity, unaffiliated with the church. 5,000 francs was a substantial sum, more than Olivier left to some of his own grandchildren. His family contested the bequest. They said Olivier had not been in his right mind when he made the will. They said the Société had unduly influenced him. The case went to court. The Société's lawyer presented evidence that Olivier had been a regular donor for years, that he had visited their facilities, that he had corresponded with the director about the work they did. The family's lawyer could not explain why Olivier would care so much about destitute men. He suggested it was eccentric, possibly evidence of senility. The court ruled in favor of the Société. The bequest stood. Reading the case file now, you can see what the family could not, or would not. Olivier had visited Rue de Lappe 11 times. He had paid for intimacy with young men who had nothing, and at the end of his life, he tried to give something back. Not to the men he had been with. They were long gone. But to men like them. Men who were desperate and alone and had nowhere else to turn. It was not redemption. It was not enough. But it was something. A wealthy man who had taken his desires into the shadows, leaving money to help the men who lived in those shadows. The Société Philanthropique still exists. It is now called the Fondation de la Société Philanthropique. It still provides aid to vulnerable people in Paris. The organization has a small museum. In the museum, there is a donor registry from 1902. Olivier Bernard's name is listed. The amount is listed. There is no explanation of why, but the money helped people. That is documented. The Société's annual report from 1903 mentions that a generous bequest allowed them to expand their shelter capacity by 12 beds. 12 more men off the streets. 12 more men who did not freeze to death that winter. One of those men might have been someone who worked in a brothel. Someone who sold what he had because he had nothing else. Someone whose name we will never know, but who survived because a banker who visited Rue de Lappe decided guilt was best transformed into action. The military officer in Laforge's notebook is listed only as Captain L. He came once, August 30th, 1889. 2 weeks before the raid, French military records from 1889 are incomplete. Many were destroyed during World War I, but enough survive to make an educated guess. There were approximately 200 captains serving in Paris or the surrounding garrisons in August 1889. Of those, about 15 had last names beginning with L. One of them was Captain Étienne Lavigne, age 34, served in the cavalry, decorated for service in Tunisia, married, no children. In September 1889, Captain Lavigne requested a transfer to a regiment in Indochina, French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam. The request was approved. He shipped out in October 1889. Requesting a transfer to Indochina in 1889 was essentially requesting a death sentence. Tropical disease, guerrilla warfare, minimal medical care. Officers who served there had a 1 in 3 chance of dying within 2 years. Captain Lavigne survived. He served in Indochina for 11 years. He was promoted to major in 1895. He retired from the military in 1900 and stayed in Saigon. He opened a small import-export business. He never returned to France. Captain Lavigne died in Saigon in 1921. He was 66. He never married again. His death certificate lists no next of kin. In his will, he left his estate to his business partner, a Vietnamese man named Nguyen Van Minh. The two men had worked together for 20 years. They lived in the same house. The will refers to Nguyen as my most trusted companion, Captain Étienne Lavigne. Captain L, it is speculation, but the timeline fits too well to ignore. A cavalry officer visits a male brothel in Paris in August 1889. 6 weeks later, he requests a transfer to the other side of the world. He never comes back. He spends the rest of his life in Indochina with a man he calls his most trusted companion. Maybe he was running from something. Maybe he found something. Maybe both. The building at 47 Rue de Lappe was not purpose-built as a brothel. It started as a residential building in the 1820s, 4 stories. Typical Parisian construction, limestone facade, narrow staircases, small rooms designed for working-class families. By the 1880s, the building had changed hands 6 times. Each owner made small modifications. A wall removed here, a door added there. The second floor, where Celeste would eventually run the brothel, had been divided into smaller units sometime in the 1860s. 3 rooms instead of 2. More rent that way. Celeste signed the lease in January 1882. The landlord was a man named Pierre Dubois, no relation to Henri. Pierre owned 4 buildings on Rue de Lappe. He lived in the 16th arrondissement and collected rent through an agent. He probably never set foot in the building. The lease specified commercial use. Celeste told the agent she was opening a boarding house for working men. The agent did not care. As long as the rent arrived on time, Pierre Dubois did not ask questions. Celeste paid 3 months in advance. 90 francs. That was a significant sum for a woman who had spent most of her life working in brothels owned by other people. Where she got the money is unclear. Savings, possibly. Or a loan from someone who believed in what she was building. The second floor needed work. The wallpaper was water-stained, the floorboards creaked, one of the windows was cracked. Celeste hired a handyman named Victor Moreau. No relation to Auguste or Lucien. Victor was 62. He had been a carpenter before arthritis ruined his hands. Now he did odd jobs for cheap. Victor spent 2 weeks making the rooms presentable. New wallpaper, proper beds instead of straw mattresses, wash basins, lamps, a lock on the front door that actually worked. Celeste paid Victor in installments. She also fed him soup and bread while he worked. Victor later told the police during the investigation after the raid that Madame Vautrin had been kind to him, that she had treated him with respect, that he had not known what the rooms would be used for. The police did not believe him. They thought he was complicit. But they had no evidence, so they let him go. Victor Moreau died in 1893. Heart failure. He was 66. His death certificate lists his occupation as labourer. It does not mention that he built the rooms where men loved each other in secret. Celeste opened the brothel in March 1882. She started with 2 employees, not Henri or Léon or any of the men who would be arrested in 1889. 2 other men whose names do not appear in any surviving records. Word spread slowly, quietly. You could not advertise a business like this. You relied on whispers, on men who had been to similar places in other cities, on clients who told friends they trusted. By 1883, Celeste had 3 employees. By 1885, 4. By 1887, 5. Henri was hired in 1886, Léon in 1888, Auguste in early 1889. Paul and Theo were both hired in 1887. The business was steady, not lucrative, not the kind of enterprise that made anyone rich. But it paid the rent, it paid the employees, it kept the operation running. Celeste was careful. She kept no written records of clients, no appointment book, no ledger with names. Everything was done by memory. You showed up, you paid, you left. No paper trail. That carefulness protected the clients. When the raid happened, when Laforge demanded records, Celeste had nothing to give him. She claimed not to remember names. The prosecutor did not believe her. But he could not prove she was lying. The only reason we have any client names at all is because Laforge kept his own surveillance notes, his unauthorized notebook, the thing his superiors told him to destroy. If Laforge had followed orders, the 47 men in that notebook would be completely anonymous. We would know the brothel existed. We would know it was raided, but we would not know who walked through that door. Laforge's disobedience saved their names. Ironically, he wanted to expose them. He wanted to destroy them. But what he actually did was preserve them, give them a kind of immortality. History is strange that way. The rooms themselves were small, about 3 meters by 4 meters each. Barely enough space for a bed, a chair, a wash basin, and a small table. The ceilings were low, 2.5 meters. If you were tall, you had to duck under the doorframe. The walls were thin. You could hear everything happening in the next room. Voices, movement, the creak of bed frames. That lack of privacy was intentional. It kept things safe. If someone became violent, if a client tried to hurt an employee, the others would hear, they could intervene. It only happened once, according to Henri's police statement. A client became aggressive with Auguste, started hitting him. Henri and Léon heard it through the wall. They broke down the door. The client ran. Celeste banned him, told him if he ever came back, she would go to the police herself. She did not care if it exposed the business. No one was allowed to hurt her employees. The client never returned. His name is not in Laforge's notebook. He must have visited before June 1889, before the surveillance started. But the incident tells you something about how the brothel operated. It was not just a business. It was a protected space. Celeste enforced rules. She defended her employees. In a world where gay men had almost no legal protection, where violence against them was ignored or justified, she created a pocket of safety. Imperfect safety. Temporary safety. But safety nonetheless. The building had a back entrance, a door that opened onto a narrow alley that ran behind the block. The alley was dark, unlit. It smelled like garbage and horse manure and the overflow from the butcher shop 2 buildings down. Some clients used the back entrance, the ones who were more afraid, the ones who could not risk being seen on Rue de Lappe itself. They would approach from a different street, slip into the alley, knock on the back door. Henri usually answered the back door. He did not mind the smell. He had grown up in Belleville, where every street smelled like something unpleasant. The alley was just Paris being Paris. One of the clients who always used the back door was a man Laforge identified as Dr. M. He came 7 times between June and September 1889. Always after midnight, always alone, always requested the same room, never requested a specific employee. He seemed to want privacy more than companionship. Laforge followed Dr. M twice. Both times he lost him in the narrow streets south of Rue de Lappe. Laforge noted in his journal that the man moved like someone familiar with being followed. He took random turns. He doubled back. He stopped to look in shop windows and used the reflections to check behind him. Whoever Dr. M was, he knew how to disappear. There is no way to identify him now. Doctors were not required to register with a central authority in 1889. There were hundreds of physicians in Paris. Any of them could have been the man who used the back door. But someone survived because of his caution. Someone lived a full life. Someone died in bed surrounded by family who never knew he had walked down an alley behind Rue de Lappe and knocked on a door in the dark. That is a kind of success. Small, private, but real. The legal context around the brothel is important to understand. Napoleon's 1791 decriminalization of sodomy was part of a broader overhaul of French law during the Revolution. The revolutionaries threw out the old Catholic legal codes entirely. They believed the state had no business regulating private morality. That philosophy lasted exactly as long as it took for people to get uncomfortable. By 1889, France still had no law against sodomy itself, but it had laws against public indecency, against corrupting minors, against outraging public morals, and crucially, it had Article 330, exciting minors to debauchery. Article 330 was written to target pimps and procurers in the female prostitution trade. But the language was broad enough to apply to almost anything. If you facilitated immoral acts, if you profited from vice, if you encouraged debauchery, you could be charged. The word minor in the article technically meant anyone under 21, but in practice, prosecutors used it flexibly. Auguste was 19, Léon was 22, Henri was 28. The prosecutor tried to argue that all of them were young enough to have been corrupted by Celeste. The defense pointed out that all 3 men were adults, that they had made their own choices, that they were not victims. The prosecutor argued that anyone who chose to engage in sodomy for money was by definition not in their right mind, that they had been led astray, that Celeste bore responsibility for their degradation. This was the circular logic that made conviction inevitable. If you were gay and poor and desperate, your choices were not really choices. You were a victim, but you were also a criminal. Punishable, but also pitiable. The law allowed no room for agency. No room for the possibility that Henri and Léon and Auguste had made rational decisions based on the options available to them. The trial was not about justice. It was about reinforcing the idea that certain kinds of desire, certain kinds of life, were unacceptable, even if they were technically legal. After the trial, legal scholars debated whether the conviction would hold up on appeal. The Napoleonic Code was clear. Sodomy was legal. Prostitution was legal. The combination should therefore be legal. But no one appealed. Céleste could not afford a lawyer for an appeal. Henri, Léon, and Auguste had no resources at all. The court-appointed attorney, Lucien Moreau, moved on to other cases. So the conviction stood, and it became precedent. Future cases involving male prostitution would cite the Vautrin trial. The logic would be repeated. The outcome would be the same. One trial, one conviction, and suddenly a whole category of existence became prosecutable. That is how oppression calcifies. One case at a time, one judge at a time, one jury that decides disgust is more important than law. The neighborhood around Rue de Lappe was mixed. Working-class families, small businesses, a few artists and bohemians who could not afford the rents in Montmartre or the Latin Quarter. People who worked with their hands, people who barely got by. Most of them knew about the brothel, or suspected. You cannot run a business where men come and go at all hours without the neighbors noticing. But Rue de Lappe was not a neighborhood of informants. People who lived there understood that survival sometimes meant minding your own business. They had their own secrets, their own grey market activities, their own reasons to avoid attracting police attention. There is only one documented complaint about the brothel before the raid. In July 1889, a woman named Madame Thibault, who lived across the street, went to the police. She said there was suspicious activity at number 47. Men visiting at strange hours, noise, immorality. The police took her statement. They filed it. They did nothing. Madame Thibault went back 2 weeks later. She was angry. She said the police were ignoring a den of vice operating openly in her neighborhood. She demanded action. The desk sergeant told her they would look into it. They did not. 3 weeks after that, Inspector Laforge began his surveillance. But he was not assigned the case because of Madame Thibault's complaints. He was assigned because of a completely different incident. In early June 1889, a young man was found dead in the Seine. His name was Philippe Grenelle. He was 23. He had been beaten and thrown into the river. The autopsy revealed evidence of sexual activity before death. The police initially assumed it was a crime of passion. A lover's quarrel turned violent. They started looking into Philippe's life. They talked to his friends, his landlord, his employer. Multiple people mentioned that Philippe had visited a place on Rue de Lappe, a place where men went to meet other men. No one would give the exact address. But the neighborhood was enough. Laforge was assigned to investigate whether Philippe's death was connected to the brothel. He started watching the building, taking notes, trying to identify clients. He never connected Philippe's murder to 47 Rue de Lappe. The case went cold. Philippe's killer was never found. But the surveillance continued. Laforge became obsessed. He spent 3 months watching the brothel. He filled a notebook with names and descriptions and theories. He convinced himself he was uncovering a massive network of degeneracy. In reality, he was watching a small business serve a marginalized community. But to a man like Laforge, that was the same as uncovering evil. Philippe Grenelle's murder is worth pausing on. He was 23 years old. He worked as a clerk at a fabric warehouse. He lived in a rented room in the 12th arrondissement. He had no family in Paris. His parents were in Amiens. They came to identify the body. The police report describes Philippe as a quiet young man, well-mannered, no known enemies, no involvement in crime or politics. The report also notes, in careful language, that Philippe was known to associate with inverts, that he frequented certain establishments, that his death might be related to his unnatural inclinations. In other words, the police thought he deserved what happened to him. The investigation was perfunctory. They questioned a few people. They made a few notes. They moved on. Philippe's parents buried him in Amiens. His death was ruled a homicide. No suspect was ever identified. But Philippe had visited Rue de Lappe. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. He had been there at least twice in the spring of 1889. He might be one of the unnamed clients in Laforge's notebook. Or he might have visited before the surveillance started. Either way, Philippe was part of this world. This hidden, fragile world of men trying to find each other in a city that wanted them invisible. And he died violently, alone, in a river, at 23. His murder was never solved. He became a statistic, another body pulled from the Seine, another casualty of a city that brutalized what it could not understand. But he had a name, Philippe Grenelle, and someone had loved him enough to throw him a lifeline, to tell him about a place on Rue de Lappe where he might find companionship. It was not enough to save him, but he had tried. He had reached for connection. He had walked through a door. That counts. It has to count. The economic reality of the brothel is stark. Clients paid 5 francs per visit. Celeste kept 2 francs as the house fee. The remaining 3 francs went to the employee, 3 francs per client. If an employee saw 2 clients in a night, that was 6 francs. 3 nights a week, 18 francs. 4 weeks in a month, 72 francs. For comparison, a factory worker in Paris in 1889 earned about 60 to 70 francs per month. A clerk earned 80 to 100 francs. A skilled tradesman might earn 120. So the pay was decent. Not exceptional, but better than most options available to young men with no education and no family connections. But there were costs. Rent for the boarding house where they lived. Food. Clothing. You had to look presentable. Clients expected a certain standard. And there was the emotional cost. The exhaustion of pretending. Of performing intimacy with strangers. Of living in a society that said what you did for work made you subhuman. Henri's police statement includes a line that did not make it into the newspapers. When asked why he stayed in the work, he said, "Where else could I go? What else could I do? This was the only place that paid me enough to live and did not ask me to pretend I was something I was not." That honesty is devastating. Henri understood that the brothel was exploitation, but he also understood that it was less exploitative than the alternatives, less violent than the streets, less dishonest than trying to live a straight life. The brothel was the least bad option. That is what most of history offers people on the margins. Not good options, just gradations of bad. Celeste's cut was 2 francs per client. If the brothel saw 10 clients in a night, that was 20 francs, 300 francs in a good month. From that, she had to pay rent on the building, 90 francs per month. She had to pay for coal and lamp oil and laundry. She had to pay Victor the handyman for repairs. She had to pay bribes. The bribes were necessary. Every brothel in Paris paid the police. It was not official. It was not recorded, but it was understood. You paid, or you got raided. Celeste paid a police inspector named Augustin Delorme 20 francs per month. Delorme worked the 11th arrondissement. He was not part of the vice squad. He was a regular beat cop who supplemented his income by looking the other way. Delorme was never charged in connection with the raid. He claimed he had no knowledge of what was happening at 47 Rue de Lappe. He said Celeste had paid him to ignore minor infractions, noise complaints, that sort of thing. No one believed him, but no one could prove otherwise. Delorme retired from the police in 1895 with full pension. He died in 1903. His obituary described him as a dedicated public servant. The bribes meant Celeste was barely breaking even. Some months she made a small profit. Some months she lost money. She was not getting rich. She was surviving. But survival was not enough for the court. The prosecutor painted her as a wealthy madam, exploiting vulnerable young men. He claimed she was making enormous profits from vice. In reality, Celeste died with almost no money. Her estate, inventoried after her death in 1897, included 1 set of clothing, a few pieces of cheap furniture, 17 francs in coins. That was it. 17 francs. Enough to live for maybe 2 weeks if you were careful. That was what a lifetime of running brothels left her. Not wealth, not comfort. Just enough to scrape by until she could not scrape anymore. The winter of 1888 was brutal in Paris. Temperatures dropped below freezing for 6 consecutive weeks. The Seine froze in places. People burned furniture to stay warm. The poor froze to death in doorways. That winter, Celeste kept the brothel open even when clients stopped coming. She could not afford the coal to heat all 3 rooms. She heated one. The employees took turns sleeping there. They huddled together for warmth. Léon later told the police, in a statement that was recorded but not used at trial, that Madame Vautrin shared her own food with them that winter, that she went without so they could eat, that she told them they were her boys and she would not let them starve. That detail appears nowhere in the trial coverage. The newspapers wanted a villain, a corrupter of youth, a woman who exploited desperate men for profit. They did not want the complicated truth, that Celeste was also desperate, that she had built something fragile and precious, that she had tried to create safety in a city that offered none. The prosecutor never asked Celeste why she hired the men she hired. If he had, she might have told him. In her statement to police, buried on page 47 of the investigation file, Celeste said, "I hired men who had nowhere else to go. Men who had been thrown out by their families. Men who had tried to live honestly and been destroyed for it. I gave them work. I gave them protection. If that is a crime, then I am guilty." The police investigator who took that statement was named Louis Bertrand. He was 31. He had been on the force for 8 years. His notes on the statement include a personal observation, written in the margin. Subject appears sincere, believes she was helping these men, does not understand why the law considers her actions criminal. Bertrand's notes were not included in the trial. They were filed with the investigation documents. They sat in an archive for over a century before a researcher found them. Louis Bertrand died in 1922. He was 65. His police record shows he served honorably for 36 years. He was never promoted above the rank of inspector. His personnel file includes a note from 1890 stating, "Good officer, but sometimes too sympathetic to subjects. Needs to maintain proper professional distance. Too sympathetic." That was his failure. He saw Celeste as a human being instead of a criminal. He wrote it down, and for that, he was marked as unreliable. The trial happened in November because the courts were backlogged. The raid happened in September. Celeste and the employees sat in jail for 8 weeks waiting for the case to be heard. 8 weeks in cells designed for short-term holding. No heat, minimal food, no contact with the outside world. Auguste got sick, a respiratory infection. The prison doctor gave him nothing, said he would recover or he would not. Auguste recovered, barely. He was released from the hospital ward 2 days before the trial started. At the trial, Auguste looked skeletal. The judge commented on it, asked if the defendant was receiving adequate nutrition in custody. The prosecutor said the defendant's appearance was not the court's concern. Auguste's lawyer objected, said his client was clearly unwell, asked for a postponement. The judge denied it, said the trial had already been delayed long enough. So Auguste sat in the courtroom, 19 years old and sick and terrified, while the prosecutor called him a prostitute and a degenerate and a victim of his own moral weakness. The jury looked at him with disgust, or pity. It is hard to say which is worse. After Auguste was sentenced, his mother sent a letter to the court. It arrived too late to affect the outcome. The letter was filed with the case documents. She wrote, "My son is a good boy. He made mistakes, but he is not what you say he is. He is my child. I raised him to be honest and kind. If he did wrong, it is because the world gave him no other choice. Please show mercy." The letter is 3 pages long. The handwriting is unsteady. She was not educated. She spelled several words wrong, but every sentence is clear. She signed it, Madame Hélène Moreau, Mother. No one responded to her letter. No judge. No prosecutor. No clerk. It was filed and forgotten, but it exists, and in it, a mother defends her son against a city that wanted him erased. That is love. Imperfect and powerless, but real. The clients who were caught in the raid were released within 48 hours. No charges filed, no names published. But their lives changed anyway. Victor Charpentier, the junior attaché at the Ministry of the Interior, lost his job within a week. His supervisor called him into the office, told him his services were no longer required. gave no official reason. Victor asked if it was because of the raid. His supervisor said, "I do not know what you are talking about. Your position has been eliminated due to budget constraints." Victor was 32. He had worked at the ministry for 9 years. He had no other skills, no connections outside the government. He could not find other work. Every position he applied for, someone had already heard. Whispers, rumors. The government was small. People talked. By December 1889, Victor was destitute. He moved back in with his parents in Versailles. He was an only child. His parents were elderly. They did not ask what had happened. They just let him stay. Victor lived with his parents for 6 years. He did not work. He did not socialize. He stayed in his childhood bedroom and read books and slowly disappeared into himself. In 1895, his father died. In 1897, his mother died. Victor inherited the house. He lived there alone for another 18 years. In 1915, during World War I, Victor volunteered for civil defense. He was too old to fight, but he worked in a hospital in Versailles, helping with wounded soldiers. He was good at it, gentle with the patients, efficient. One of the doctors he worked with, a man named Antoine Roussel, later wrote in his memoir that Victor was the kindest volunteer he had ever met, that the soldiers loved him, that he had a gift for making frightened young men feel safe. Victor died in 1919, Spanish flu. He was 62. He left the house to the hospital. In his will he wrote, "I have no family. Give this to someone who can use it for good." The hospital sold the house, used the money to buy medical equipment. A small plaque in the hospital acknowledges the donation. It reads, "In memory of Victor Charpentier, volunteer, 1915-1919. It does not say he was arrested in a brothel. It does not say his career was destroyed by a raid. It just says he volunteered. He helped. He gave what he had. That is the legacy. Quiet, anonymous, but real." The other 2 clients caught in the raid are harder to trace. Their names were not recorded. They were released and vanished into Paris. But someone remembered them. In 1932, 43 years after the raid, a journalist named Marguerite Durand published a memoir. Marguerite had been a feminist activist and newspaper publisher. She had spent her life documenting the lives of women in Paris. Prostitutes, laundresses, factory workers. Women the official histories ignored. In her memoir, she included a chapter about male prostitution. She wrote about the Vautrin trial. She had attended as a young journalist in 1889. She had been horrified by the proceedings. She wrote, "The court treated those young men as criminals and victims simultaneously. They were punished for selling their bodies, but also pitied for having been led astray." The logical contradiction was ignored. What stayed with me was the clients. 3 men were caught in the raid. They were released immediately. Their names were protected. I saw one of them in the hallway outside the courtroom. He was weeping. He begged a police officer to let him leave through a side entrance. He said his wife was waiting outside. He could not let her see him. The officer laughed, told him to pull himself together. The man stood in that hallway for 20 minutes before he found the courage to walk out. Marguerite did not identify the man, but she witnessed his terror, and she wrote it down. She made sure someone remembered that fear. Marguerite Durand died in 1936. She was 71. She left her personal archives to the city of Paris. The archives are now the Bibliothèque Marguerite Durand. They contain thousands of documents about women's lives in 19th and early 20th century Paris. Buried in those archives is a folder labelled Vie et Sexualité. Inside the folder is a handwritten note. It says, "The men who loved men in 1889 had no advocates." I tried to bear witness. It was not enough. But it was something. That note sits in a library. Anyone can read it. Almost no one does. The geography of the brothel matters. Rue de Lappe is 200 meters long. It runs east from Place de la Bastille. In 1889, it was lined with workshops and cheap housing and a few small cafes that catered to workers. Today, the street looks different. The workshops are gone. The buildings have been renovated. The cafes are trendy. The rent is high. But the street remembers. In the 1920s, Rue de Lappe became famous for its dance halls. Working-class Parisians went there to dance the Java, a popular waltz. The dance halls were loud and crowded and joyful. Some of those dance halls welcomed gay couples. Not openly, not officially. But if two men wanted to dance together, no one stopped them. The street had a reputation, a history. People knew. By the 1960s, Rue de Lappe had gay bars, Le Troisième Lieu, Le Bronx, small places, dark. You had to know someone to find them, but they existed. The bars are mostly gone now. Gentrification, rising rents. The neighborhood changed. But for 80 years, Rue de Lappe was a place gay men could go, a place they could find each other. That lineage is not accidental. The street held the memory. The men who danced in those halls in the 1920s did not know about Celesta's brothel. The men who drank in those bars in the 1960s did not know about the raid. But they knew the street. They knew it was safe, or safer. They knew other men had been there before them. Geography holds history. Even when the people forget, the place remembers. In 2015, a community group in the 11th arrondissement proposed installing a historical plaque at 47 Rue de Lappe. The plaque would commemorate the brothel, acknowledge its place in LGBTQ+ history. The proposal went to the district council. The council debated it. Some members supported it. Others did not. One council member said, "We should not celebrate prostitution. We should not glorify a criminal enterprise." Another said, "We are not celebrating prostitution. We are acknowledging that gay men existed, that they had nowhere to go, that this place mattered." The vote was close. The plaque proposal was rejected. 9 votes against, 7 votes in favor. So, there is no plaque. The building at 47 Rue de Lappe has no marker, nothing to indicate what happened there. The restaurant on the ground floor serves excellent couscous. The couple in the upstairs apartment has no idea. But the proposal happened. 7 people voted yes. 7 people on a district council in 2015 said this history deserves recognition. That is progress. Slow, insufficient, but real. The trial transcripts end with the sentencing. The judge reads the sentences. Céleste, 2 years. Henri, 8 months. Léon and Auguste, 6 months each. Then the judge says, "This court hopes that these sentences will serve as a warning to others who would profit from vice. The Republic will not tolerate establishments that corrupt the morals of its citizens." The transcript notes, "Court adjourned. That is it. No final statements from the defendants, no reactions. Just the cold administrative language of the law." But in the margins of the transcript, someone wrote a note. The handwriting is different from the court clerk's. It might be Lucien Moreau, the defense attorney. It might be someone else who was in the courtroom. The note says, "Injustice." 1 word. Written in pencil. Faint. Almost illegible after more than a century. But it is there. Someone who witnessed the trial thought it was wrong, and they wrote it down. That matters. In the face of institutional cruelty, someone said no, even if they said it quietly. Even if they said it in the margin of a document almost no one would ever read. They said it. The employees scattered after they were released. Henri to the streets and eventual disappearance. Léon to Edouard and 30 years of quiet companionship. Auguste to Marseille and Claude and a life built from wreckage. Paul to Madagascar and a grave no one visits. Theo to Nice and Jean-Louis and a house in the hills where they smiled for a photograph in 1910. 5 men, 5 completely different outcomes, but all of them shaped by one moment. One raid. One night when the door broke and the police came in and their lives split into before and after. What unites them is not tragedy. Not all of their stories ended badly. What unites them is the choice they made to walk through a door, to accept work that society said degraded them, to survive however they could in a city that wanted them invisible. That choice required courage. Not the kind of courage that gets you a medal, the quiet kind, the everyday kind. The courage to keep living when the world tells you your life is shameful. Henri had that courage. Léon had it. Auguste had it. Paul had it. Theo had it. So did the clients. Émile and Jacques and Olivier and Dr. M and Captain L and Father G and EB and all the others. They walked down Rue de Lappe knowing they could lose everything. They did it anyway because loneliness is its own kind of death. And connection, even purchased, even hidden, even temporary, is worth the risk. The Vautrin trial was not a major historical event. It did not change laws. It did not spark protests. It was a local scandal that filled newspapers for a few weeks and then faded. But it mattered to the people it touched. It destroyed some of them. It saved others. It marked them all. And because the record survived, because Laforgue kept his notebook, and Marguerite Durand wrote her memoir, and Victor Moreau's handyman invoices were filed, and Léon's will was probated, and the trial transcript was archived, we know their names. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some. Henri Dubois, Léon Favier, Auguste Moreau, Paul Renard, Théo Blanchard, Céleste Vautrin, Émile Bergerac, Victor Charpentier, Philippe Granel, real people, real lives, real moments of joy and fear and desire and survival. They lived in a city that said they should not exist. They existed anyway. They found each other. They built something. They held on. And when the city came for them, when the police broke down the door and the court passed judgment and the newspapers called them degenerates, some of them survived. Not all, but some. That is the story. Not perfect, not triumphant, but true. In 1982, 100 years after Céleste opened the brothel, a gay activist named Jean-Michel Rousseau organized a small memorial walk. 23 people showed up. They walked down Rue de Lappe. They stopped at number 47. Jean-Michel read a statement. He said, 100 years ago, men loved each other in this building. The law said it was legal. Society said it was shameful. The men did it anyway. We are here because they were here. We exist because they refused to stop existing. The walk was not covered by any newspaper. No official record exists. We only know it happened because Jean-Michel mentioned it in an interview years later. But 23 people stood on Rue de Lappe in 1982 and said thank you to people who had been dead for decades. They connected themselves to a history most of the world had forgotten. That connection is the point. That is what memory does. It builds a chain. It says, you are not the first. You are not alone. People came before you. They survived. You will too. Jean-Michel Rousseau died in 1995. He was 47. AIDS. His partner, Daniel, scattered his ashes in the Seine, the same river where Philippe Granel's body was found in 1889. The river connects them. Geography connects them. Memory connects them. Paris has changed. France has changed. The law has changed. Gay marriage is legal now. Pride parades fill the streets. The closet still exists, but the door is easier to open. But in 1889, there was no movement, no community centre, no hotline, no support group. There was a brothel on Rue de Lappe. There were 5 young men and 1 middle-aged woman trying to create a space where men could be themselves for an hour. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. But it was what they had, and they built it with their own hands and their own risk and their own bodies. Céleste Vautrin died in a rented room in Belleville. She was buried in an unmarked grave. She left behind 17 francs and a few pieces of furniture and a legacy she never got to see, because she mattered, not to the law, not to the church, not to the historians who wrote about the Belle Époque and ignored the brothels and the raids and the men who loved men in secret. But she mattered to Henri and Léon and Auguste and Paul and Theo. She gave them work when no one else would. She fed them when they were hungry. She protected them when the world was dangerous. She did not save them. She could not. But she tried. And for some of them, that was enough to make the difference between surviving and disappearing. That is what we owe her. Recognition, not sainthood. She was not perfect. She ran a business. She profited from desperation. But she also created safety in a world designed to crush people like her. She deserves to be remembered. Her name deserves to be said out loud. Céleste Vautrin, born 1833, died 1897, ran a brothel for gay men in Paris, went to prison for it, died poor, mattered anyway. The men who walked through the green door at 47 Rue de Lappe were not heroes. They were not activists. They were clerks and bankers and lawyers and shopkeepers who wanted what everyone wants. Touch, intimacy, a few hours where they did not have to pretend. They paid for it, not just with money, with risk, with fear, with the constant knowledge that exposure meant ruin. Some of them were exposed, some of them were ruined, but most of them walked away. They went back to their lives. They married women they did not love, or they stayed single and endured the questions. They lied to their families and their friends and themselves. And they carried Rue de Lappe with them, a memory of a place where, for an hour, they were allowed to be real. That memory is fragile. It does not survive in monuments or textbooks. It survives in margins of trial, transcripts and notebooks the police were supposed to destroy, and wills that mention most trusted companions and photographs hidden in walls. It survives because someone, somewhere, refused to let it disappear completely. Inspector Laforge wanted to erase them. The prosecutor wanted to erase them. The judge wanted to erase them. The newspapers wanted to sensationalize them and then forget them. But here we are, more than a century later, saying their names, telling their stories, refusing to let them be forgotten. That is the vigil. That is what tonight has been. Not a history lesson, not entertainment. A vigil, sitting with people who died alone and afraid and making sure they are not alone anymore. You and I, right now, are keeping them company. We are saying their names. We are bearing witness to their lives. We are refusing to let the silence win. Émile Bergerac went to Rue de Lappe 17 times. He died in 1911 without ever telling the truth. But we know the truth now. We say it for him. Léon Favier spent 6 months in prison for being poor and beautiful and desperate. But he also spent 30 years with Edouard. He had love. He had a life. We remember both. Auguste Moreau lost his mother's forgiveness but found Claude. He lived and loved and wrote letters he never sent. We remember him. Henri Dubois disappeared from the records at 33. We do not know how he died, but we know how he lived. We remember him. Théo Blanchard escaped to Nice with a man who paid double, and they had 31 years together. They smiled in a photograph. We remember that smile. Céleste Vautrin went to prison for giving desperate men work and desperate clients safety. She died poor, but she was not forgotten. We remember her. These people existed. They mattered. They built something fragile and precious in the gaps where the law did not reach and society refused to look. And now, tonight, in whatever year you are hearing this, in whatever country, in whatever language, they are here with us. Not as abstractions, not as symbols, as people. Flawed people, complicated people. People who made choices with limited options and survived as best they could. People like us. People like everyone who has ever had to hide who they are. People like everyone who has ever been told their love is illegal or immoral or impossible. They walked through the door anyway. They loved anyway. They survived anyway. And we get to inherit that courage. We get to stand on the foundation they built, often without meaning to, often without knowing anyone would remember, but we remember. That is what this channel does. That is what tonight has been. So if you found yourself drawn into this story, the like button helps the channel reach others who need it too. As you drift off tonight, think about the men who walked down Rue de Lappe in 1889. The ones whose names we know and the ones we will never know. The ones who survived and the ones who did not. Think about the green door, the red lamp, the faded wallpaper. The moment when two people in a small room decided that an hour of honesty was worth the risk. May your dreams be free of green doors you are afraid to knock on. May you never have to hide in rooms behind brothels to be yourself. And may you remember that every freedom you have was built by people whose names were almost lost. Good night, and sleep well.